my left. Here is hopeless after the hat. That's okay.
I've had whole years where I had hat head.
He's laughing.
My hair's the wrong length.
You're laughing at me for.
No, I know you made me think about myself.
Okay, coming out now.
If my hair's too short,
Downstairs to the front.
I have constant hair.
I wake up
How
in
come-
the morning.
I
Talk about bad hair days, but mine's a mess all up.
So there's Wallace and Foxy and Dr. Mary Jones, all without their cameras on. That's fine. It's your choice. I understand that to a point.
We do like to see you, though.
You
Yeah,
know,
I don't have a webcam today. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. And so I am happy to bring us into the room. It got colder than any of us wanted in the last few hours.
Oh, yeah.
People were walking and bracing themselves. Yeah.
I want to apologize for last week for my being so upset.
It's all right.
For
We
what?
told you. You know,
You're allowed to be upset, Mary.
Thank you. I'm mean. I just want to punch Putin so bad.
It's better than being in a class where no one talks.
That's
right.
You don't have to worry.
Your rage is why there is feminist studies of the
That's right.
Yeah, so I'm with you.
Yeah, there's, you know, as Johnny Rotten from Public Image punk rock band says, anger is an energy. It's just, what do we do with it? Right? It's sort of value neutral. Unlike what a lot of white Protestant culture likes to suggest, that anger is always
Yeah,
wrong.
right.
That's
Oh,
not
right.
correct.
It's not correct.
It's like pretending that there's no shadow side. Right?
Yeah, I'm being honest about yourself. Part of the truth of a situation is our emotional response. So we shouldn't like tear into people and dump upon them. But, you know, I mean, at some level, you know, hey, this isn't okay. It's all right to say it and to say it like that, right? You know.
That's
Yeah. It just hit me like a sucker, like a punch in the gut, especially right after the vigils. You know, it was just.
Cool.
Yeah,
That sounds great. It's fine, Mary. Don't worry. Don't worry. I'm not afraid to ask someone to come back in the covenant, and you were never out. You know, you were just energetic.
Mary, unlike some of the others that didn't grow up with it, we grew up with the imminent threat of world war and nuclear war. And I think it hits us a lot harder than it does people that are a generation or further behind us.
Here we are.
Okay.
That's right. There you go. See, all kinds of wisdom shared in this room. All right. So let's go around and just remind folks of your name and share the most exciting thing from our reading this week. So I'm going to say first, Reverend Scott Sandler Michael, co-minister. My most exciting thing from the reading this week was being reminded, you know, what a divider Ezra and Nehemiah were.
So, hi, I'm Helen. So I don't know if this is exciting, but one of my things that got me as I was reading this,
Good.
Harlots and
Yes.
was, I don't buy this. This is a really weak argument about slavery was different then.
Oh, okay.
That really pissed me off. Like,
Yeah.
so that.
Cool. We'll come back to that. Yeah. So yeah. We'll come back to that. We won't let that. We're going to spend more time with this in week 5, I think, than this week.
Okay.
I wanted people to read this, and if there's something that talks and helps us understand the stories we were reading this week, that's fine and that's great. But I think So we'll spend a little more time directly with that. But feel free to send us there if we should, because we are going to talk to someone about slavery tonight. So we may go back to that.
I didn't completely, but okay.
Okay. All right. Say hello to all the pretty people.
Hello, Susan Spanier.
All right.
And I don't know.
Okay, she doesn't know. It was all equally exciting,
It
or
was, yeah, it was.
or equally.
And I learned
Yes.
so much.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah,
That's
I
nice.
mean, really stuff that I didn't remember.
Yep.
I mean, not that I was ever a Bible reader, but
Okay. We understand.
my father, who had a Bible right next to his bed and read every night.
Oh, wow, really?
So osmosis.
There you go. That's right. All right. So I'm going to go to the screens. Mary, then Deb, then Foxy, then Wallace, and then we'll come back to the room. So Mary first.
Hey, I think what I found intriguing, I guess you could say, was the Samson and Delilah story. I have to say that the narrators or the editors who wrote this story did your gender reference, Scott, no justice. Don't think I have ever met a man or even a boy that was that stupid.
You obviously not met one of my brothers. Yes, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Deb.
You know, Mary, you took the words out of my mouth, although I think you said them in a bit of a more interesting way. I'm Deb Corbett, she, her, and I'm thinking, you know, I did the reading today and I went, I had no idea, you know, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, 3 times. Like, stop telling her, you know? So anyway, I had the same exact impression of that's what struck me the most. I didn't know enough because also it was a self-contained kind of story where some of the other ones made reference to future and past that are not in my brain. So it was a little harder to see.
Uh-oh, you went mute on us just the last word. So
Oh.
just letting you know.
No, what, I'm done.
Okay, thanks. All right, then Foxy, then Wallace.
This is Foxy from Columbus, Ohio. She, her. The thing I took from this, and probably is going to come for a surprise, seed.
Mhm.
And the use and misuse of the word by our author.
Or
Wallace?
author. Wait, you mean our author Frymer-Kinsky or by the authors of the Bible?
Not by the authors of the Bible. I know how they intend it,
Okay,
particularly when I go back and I read the Hebrew version.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll come back to that. Thanks. All right, Wallace.
Hi, Wallace, she, her. I also had the same note about the Delilah and Samson story. Like, well, I don't, I feel like he should have been so annoyed by her, but he just let it happen. Mysterious.
Yeah. Cool. All right, awesome. And we're back into our
All
room.
right, hey
Johanna.
everybody, Johanna Foster, she, her, hers, and I think what one of the things that intrigued me about the set of readings for this week was Frymer-Kinsky's analysis of, or the teaching that other foreign villain, right? The that those that foreign, right, has been put on, right, later in the historical record, and I did not know that, and that was very interesting to me to think about, right, the equation in that way. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you. Nicole Gray, she, her, hers. I had 3 takeaways, and I'll make them brief. The first one is a writer I was completely enchanted or curious about the word Philistines. And I loved the way it was explained later on. And I found myself while reading, seeking all these, like, you know, these attributes out in the population. And it's an interesting etymology. Secondly, is the dichotomy between, like, at the beginning, it felt like a lot of the women were using, strategically using sexuality, right? And it was very focused on that. But Delilah, she talks.
Yeah.
She,
Uh-huh.
you know,
Good
and
words.
I'm loving that.
Frymer-Kinsky goes out of her way to say
I
it was just good
love
words.
that. I love the departure from like, you know, the sexual trope and then finally, again, like coming back to the Delilah, Samson and Delilah. The sentence just blew me away. He was a grinder in the prison. Now, what exactly does that mean? What is up with that? It was in the Bible part. He was a grinder in the prison. Somebody wrote about
I
grinding
know,
in
I
prison.
know. Yeah, cool. I'm gonna look that one up. Yeah. All right, and Debbie Ann, thank you. Thank you very much.
And she, her, I also was at the Samson part. So
Speak up.
That's right.
I don't think.
Samson and how he was, you know, fooling horses sight and everything like that. Yeah.
Can I jump in with something?
Yeah, please.
So the section about the other, and of course Johanna brought that up, and it struck me so
Back in
much,
291,
looking at my, that this was setting things up forever, like for where we are still, it's the other. And then I loved this line that, you know, the rabbis converted the women beforehand, so they were no longer foreign. Isn't that interesting?
That's
How was
right.
to marry them? I mean, yeah, like, isn't that convenient?
Yeah.
So it's sort of how it's been in our melting pot. If you turn into, you know, the white, then you're okay.
All right, so I think we're going to start there, because I want to save for the end of the class, you know, the more colorful tales. Maybe we'll try and end on Samson and Delilah, because that'll
Reverend
lead us
Scott,
last.
can I ask a question of you? On page, I guess it was 77, they used the word Nazarite. Is Nazarite in this someone from Nazareth, or is
No.
it a sect?
It's a
Yes, go ahead.
sect.
Apostle
Okay.
Moses.
There was a group of highly devoted, very godly men who never shaved, never had their hair cut. It's part of what you will see in Hadassah communities where the men have the palum, the two braids down either side.
And the sects too.
Yes.
Okay.
But it was a very narrow sect, and normally you vow into it and you can break that vow and pull out, whereas Samson was put in it at birth.
Yep.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Yeah, and we're not sure if it's, you know, geologically or geographically, I'm not sure if they got that name from being near Nazareth, but I don't think so. Most of the scholars think actually the city of Nazareth was named that because there were a lot of Nazarites there, but no, that's really unsettled. I don't know if anyone else found anything else out about that, but yeah, so that's a great question. And, you know, all these things are in our culture, and then it makes it easy for us to think we know what we're reading when we don't, right? You know, that's always the problem reading ancient texts, you know. Yeah, all right, awesome. So let's look at page 283, I believe it is, in this Frymer-Kinsky text. And actually, go ahead and get your pages open to that. We're going to read through some of that stuff, but we're also going to read in the New Interpreters, but it's Outsider Women. Yep, beginning of and so at the beginning of the New Interpreters Bible, you know, there's a little introduction to Ezra, which I think helps us understand where this is all coming from. So the story in Ezra is of the second exile in Judaic history. So one of them happened around 800 before the Common Era. This one happens around 580 or something of the Common Era, before the Common Era BC. And this is done by the Babylonians. And the story suggests, and there seems to be some evidence that this was true as well from the Persian side, that Persian kings, after about 55, 60 years, repopulated Israel, Palestine, with people who were related to those who were originally sent away. So when they would get rid of a people like this, there were different things that would happen. They would just kill them all, or they would disperse them, or sometimes in a culture where they felt that those people might have skills they could benefit from, they would bring them with them. And for whatever reason, and it doesn't seem to be clear in my recollection of the old biblical tales, and there doesn't seem to be much historical reasoning why, they seem to have taken a lot of the Jewish nobility and aristocracy and like the high-level civil servants to Babylon. And it's very similar to the story that we shared on Sunday in worship about Daniel. Daniel was one of these who was taken into captivity and proved to be a very worthy servant to the king, which is why the king is very happy when the lions don't eat Daniel in the lion's den. So at some point, the Persians seem to believe it's in their interest, because they wouldn't have done this if there wasn't some political, economic, whatever interest to do this. They take a group of these folks who have been living amongst themselves. They never really integrated with the larger Babylonian culture, or most of them did not. And sends them back to sort of recolonize Jerusalem, which had been destroyed, with a whole new group of folks that are apparently related to the people who were taken away 60 years earlier. And it's a very unusual thing that doesn't seem to have happened many. So what does all that mean? It's just important to understand this is a very unusual time in history. So the first thing I want us to consider is, what is the nature of being a captive people, of having your whole culture, your aristocracy, your leaders, your priests, your high-level civil servants, etc., uprooted and taken to another place? What happens is a couple of things. Number one, well, they were brought there for a reason, and they have to serve Babylon, and then the Persians take over Babylon, which is how, over time, that's how they're brought back by one of the Xerxes, Artaxerxes 1 or 2. Nobody's certain when
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar, that's right. And so, yeah, they have. So when you're a captive people, there are a handful of things that can happen. You can just assimilate if that culture will let you, and there's nothing to suggest that culture would not have let them, but they stuck to themselves. And it is here in exile that the rules governing what does it mean to be Jewish are codified. Because what they were trying to do is maintain themselves as a people surrounded by this whole other civilization. Even though some of them worked for, benefited from the larger civilization, for whatever reason, they felt, and probably rightfully so, if you look at the history of Israel's, kings and all that, they felt they were much less of a threat remaining in Jerusalem and trying to regain Jerusalem than if they were like a ghetto in Babylon. And so that's where they end up being at this time. And so a lot of the rules that we've come to understand as Judaism, like a lot of that stuff that's in Deuteronomy and Leviticus about, you won't eat this and you won't wear that, and you'll only marry this kind of person. All of those rules, most scholars believe now, were mostly written down in their detail and their thoroughness during captivity, because they were trying to keep themselves together as a people. So it wasn't, that what's often put forth as the law of Moses, is probably really not written down by Moses, in other words, right? Because Moses comes way before all this. So what does all that mean? That means that in captivity, as these people get focused on keeping their identity, the most important thing is to be able to say, we are the people that do this, but we're not the people that do that. And, so for instance, I had a great teacher in Judaic studies at the University of Chicago, Rabbi Fishbein. And Rabbi Fishbein, I could tell he loved doing this. He probably does this every first day of like Hebrew Studies 1, right? So tell me why I'm not supposed to eat shellfish, and everyone gives all the answers. Tell me why I'm not supposed to eat pork. Oh, trichinosis. No, it's because we're the people that do this, and we're the people that don't do that. It's what marks us as a people. And often those markings were done in deliberate opposition to the peoples that nation was next to.
So it wasn't for really to keep people safe from eating stuff that was gonna go bad?
Doesn't make sense because the cultures right next to them ate pork. The Canaanites ate lots of pork. So yeah, that is a Christian what's called supersessionalist argument to try and explain why these things we don't understand in the Bible are there. And Rabbi Fishbein would say over and over, it's because we're the people that do this, and we're not the people who do that. And that's how we know who we are.
Wow.
Right?
So it's like sociology 101. So it could also be a sociologist, yeah, right? It's sort of it's symbolic, right? The sort of ritual, right?
Wow,
Yeah.
Function.
That's really interesting.
Like the cool kids and the non-cool kids, or like the nerds.
Right.
Right, like,
That's right.
you don't do this and you're a nerd. You
Right.
don't get to.
That's right.
Could be
That's right. You see it in middle school in really
Yeah.
mean ways.
Yeah.
So that's what I will propose us to think about when we look at these rules. And then, of course, there's rules and then there's rules and then there's rule freaks. So it does seem to be Ezra was a bit of a rules freak. They send him here, and so I'll just read some of this from this introduction. This is from the New Interpreter's Bible, if you have that, but all your study Bibles should have a good introduction to Ezra. So his role has been compared to others, like an Egyptian priest and scribe who was sent back to his home country by the Persians to restore the cult and reorganize the institutions of scribalism and religious learning. For whatever peoples believed in these different gifts, they had a deep belief in blood theology, which is a very dangerous thing. We've found out since then, but they believed that certain groups of people were better at X, Y, and Z. And what determined those groups of people was not just what they did and didn't do, but also their bloodlines. And that's why there's so much attention in ancient texts to who begat whom, who's of this line, who's of that line. And what we've seen, what we know now, looking back on 5,000 years of history, is what that creates is entrenched monarchies and groups, small groups of people that hold power over generations. And it also creates this notion that somehow people with certain types of blood are better than people with other types of blood.
I.e. race, yes.
Whether it's race, nationality, however it is, right?
Yeah.
So when we think of the Bible as simply cataloging these ideas and how they lived out, because in some ways, I wonder sometimes if the book of Ezra is actually saying this is a good thing, because he forces these mass divorces and everybody gets furious. And later generations really denounce Ezra for going that far. Anyway, so a little bit more from this introduction. So let's see, where is that? So after the leaders,
notice too who were the prime targets: the tribes of Conan and Levi.
Yeah.
Later known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the people that ran the temple. And what happened when Jesus showed up? He ran them out of the temple.
Out of the temple. Yeah. So she's speaking about two different lines. So when Jacob, the son of Rebekah and Isaac, becomes Israel and has his children, the 12 children, which become the 12 tribes of Israel, this bloodline idea is like intensified. So like only the Cohens are the priests, and the Levites are the kings, and you have to trace your bloodline not back just to a real Jew, not just back to someone from a certain family, but like to a particular offspring of Jacob and Leah, or Jacob and Rachel. And it's, after a couple hundred years, I imagine it can't be that easy. I'm just saying, after a couple decades. And so what happens and they get terrified that because of this unfortunate belief that a lot of human worth and quality comes because of the blood that we inherit, they reject folks from the outside, which is weird, because if you look at the stories we were reading like earlier, you know, they seem, the early matriarchs like, you know, Rebecca and Sarah, they seem okay with not doing what the culture expects. But then we have this whole generation trying to reestablish Israel. And the first thing they do, that Ezra does practically, is say, oh no, all these wives you have, them and your kids have to go. How nuts is that?
Well, you just hit seed. It's the seed.
It's the
And
seed, that's right.
elsewhere in the Bible, seed literally refers to sperm.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
Now we're
Yeah.
talking about a patriarchal society where your tribe is determined by your father, but your Jewishness is determined by your mother. Anyone can father a kid, but only a mother can deliver it.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you get rid of your wives, if you keep the kids, which was common then,
Yeah.
the kids stayed with dad. If you got rid of your wives and kept the kids, and the whole point of this exercise was to remove the foreign influence on the bloodline, you've just reinfected yourself.
Right.
So the
According to
kids
Ez-
had to go too.
Yep. And if you look at
Question
other
about
parts,
this. Maybe Foxy can answer. How were women viewed then as?
Equal partners.
I know they didn't understand the seed, you know, the egg of the woman at that point, just the man. But did they feel that a kid had part of her in her, or was she just a machine to pop out seeds?
That one I can't answer. I
So
wish I
I'll just-
could. I never occurred to me to ask anybody.
It's a great question.
I'll share just a couple of things. So there are times when the son often has qualities of the mother, and this is most evidenced with Jacob, who becomes Israel. He's known as the trickster. Well, his mom was known as a trickster, right? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so there are times, but it's not really drawn. It's not like, oh, and Jacob was like his mom, or, you know, Nathaniel was like his mom. But we do see that. So
they must have known.
So obviously, you know, they couldn't go against people's experience with their own family and their own neighbors, because we know lots of people whose male children resemble the mother more than the father, and vice versa. It's just true. So you can only write these stories so much with the party line before people won't believe them and will not accept them.
The other
And
thing that brings to some degree of strength is the fact that when you go to name a child, you're supposed to name, if you go to name your child and you've had a death in the family, and it doesn't matter if it's the paternal family or the maternal family, the next child born is supposed to carry some portion of that name. So obviously it wasn't just the patriarchy, the matriarchy mattered too.
Okay.
Be as official or have as much power or all that stuff. Yeah, you're exactly correct. Yep.
And just
So
like
let's-
Muslim households now, everything that went on, it goes on in the house is her business.
That's right.
Everything.
A Muslim professor friend of mine, an Irishman, Chris Taylor. He used to teach at Drew University. I think he's at Union Theological Seminary now. He met a woman from Egypt and wanted to marry her, and she was like, well, you got to come home and get my family's permission. And so he shows up, and the father's like, oh, no, walks out indignant. And then Chris is like, wow, I just flew all the way to Egypt and this isn't gonna happen. And then they're like, just relax. Sat him down, gave him some tea. First, the women assessed him and deemed him okay, and they said, go back to Cairo, come back. And he comes back, and then the father gets to make a big gesture like, oh, now let us talk, and maybe I will give you a chance to prove yourself. Because he's already been told by the women of the house that your daughter's marrying this guy, so you better figure it out. So they let him, his future father-in-law, do a show that he actually controls the house that he doesn't control.
Interesting. Yep.
This is not uncommon.
Happened to me.
Is that right?
Yeah.
No way. I can't imagine someone not wanting you to marry Jill.
Well, my father.
Oh, wow. There you go. Tell it. You want to tell us about that?
Tell us. Yeah.
Oh, well. My mother and father were divorced. And my mother really liked Joe and knew how much, I cared about him and how much he cared about me and what a good husband he would be. So my mother talked to my dad before telling him that you have to know, my father was Southern, not Baptist, but Presbyterian and Joe is Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And so my mother talked to him in a way that she knew how to get through to him, even though they were divorced, they were friends. It wasn't, she never said a bad thing about my father, and my dad never, well, not that he had anything bad he could say about my mother.
There you go.
But so it happened,
Wow.
And that was only 57 years ago.
Yeah,
Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that.
that's a great story.
you.
So this is how folks with less power, oftentimes women, certainly in these stories, how they end up exercising some power. And we saw that more in our first couple of weeks. Today's different. Today's kind of a holy harangue for those of you who saw my service a couple of weeks ago. So this bit about Ezra. I'm just going to read some of this here. All right. So first, Frymer-Kinsky reminds us the context of this bit here, and this actually begins in Ezekiel. So she sets this up by reminding us how, as the books of the Bible are being written through time. So the books, like Ezekiel and such, are later written books than like Genesis and the Torah. And how she says that, over time, Israel herself begins to be seen as a woman. And in trying to understand why Israel as a nation has not always followed the will and plan of Yahweh in being righteous and being good stewards of the power in the land, it creates a metaphor of the parentage, which includes Israel being actually having a Hittite mother, a Canaanite father, and a Hittite mother she shares. And God adopted her as his ward and betrothed her at puberty. But her origin with the Hittite mother was the cause of Jerusalem's wantonness and God's devastation. So not only is it bad enough that everyone blames Eve, but it seems like there becomes new female figures throughout the Bible that get blamed for all of Israel's woes, even though it's simply just a metaphor for the nation. Like some nations conceive of themselves as a fatherland, some as a motherland. And here they're using nationalism and racism and and misogyny to describe why the nation can't behave itself. And the nation, for the record, is ruled by men. So anyway, so the above that was the women's fault. I don't know. I don't know how this happens. Y'all have to tell me how this happens.
Which page are you?
This, I'm on page 286, the beginning of the chapter Outsider Women. So look, everyone pronounces upon you will say this proverb, like mother, like daughter. You are the daughter of your mother who spurned her husband and sons, and you are the sister of your sisters who spurned their husbands and children. Your mother was Hittite, your father Amorite, your big sister is Samaria, which is another place they hated. And her daughter is she who sits on your left, and your sister who is smaller than you is Sodom. You know Sodom, right? You know, from Sodom and Gomorrah. So yeah, this is what they think about the parentage of their own nation. This is difficult. I have a hard time with this. This is my hardest. I have a hardest time probably with Ezra and some of the later books of the Hebrew canon. The earlier texts I find easier to read. All right, so there's all this stuff, right? Your sister Saddam did not do, nor her daughters, as you and your daughters have done. I mean, just like, wow. So you not only were they awful, you're worse. And of course, he's supposedly speaking to the country, but the effect, you know, he's speaking about women still, right? And this is just horrifying. And so, you know, so Ezekiel is a particularly difficult and vibrant visionary in the prophetic literature. He has lots of just, it's interesting and wild stuff, very full of symbol and metaphor. But obviously, you know, he didn't invent this metaphor. He's employing something these folks already thought. He's appealing to the way that his culture, his audience already thinks about their own country and frankly about women. So it's important to remember that. Like, so this is not the invention of misogyny. This is the use of misogyny to make a point, which I don't think makes it any better, but just making sure we understand the difference. And so, yeah, her genetic nature remains, Frymer-Kinsky says, so that her behavior was like a mother, like daughter. And Ezekiel's portrayal of Jerusalem's misbehavior carries the clear message to human society. Even though a girl may leave her birth family never leaves her. And this is why this injunction against having foreign wives. And they begin to blame, especially in the book of Kings, they begin to blame foreign women for everything bad that happens to Israel, Jerusalem.
It sounds just like today.
Oh, that's right. Lock her up, right?
It's just,
Right.
yeah, but the foreigners. So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. All right. So what she goes to explain a little bit about how this amplifies and abscesses. And this is that second full paragraph on page 284. Matters came to a head in the Persian period. This is when, you know, there's no king of Israel. There's no king to represent the unity of the people, and opinion was divided as to whether monarchy had been a good thing for Israel. And down below, it's, you know, this difference of opinion erupts into conflict at the time of Ezra, and leaders of the community come before Ezra to complain of foreign marriages in all strata of the community. And then I'm not going to do all of the holy harangue, but when these matters were concluded, the leaders approached me thus: the people Israel, the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands, according to the abominations of all those peoples. For they have married their daughters for wives for themselves and their sons, and they have mixed the holy seed with the peoples of the lands. And their leaders and magistrates were first in this transgression. And when I heard this manner, says Ezra, I tore my garment and my robe. I tore out bunches of my hair and beard, and I sat appalled. But he didn't know this was going on before this guy comes up and tells him. And obviously this is a leader because he's talking to the leader of the community. He's not just some nut on the street's going to come up and say, hey, this is what you should do. I mean, there's a political component to this too, right? It's like, you know, those leaders would probably be a better pronoun in the beginning. Those leaders have done this, and you need to do something about them because I did not marry a foreign wife. And so, you know, and that Ezra's character, at least in the book, doesn't see this. You know, he's either just politically stupid, which I think kind of he is, or he's deliberately just buying into this bloodlust, this bloodline theology, which is, in my estimation, at the bottom of so much of the evils and injustices in our world. All right, I've said a whole lot. And the people's responses.
Can you educate us a bit on, I was somewhat lost on
Yes.
so the kind of, returning to a place where one, right, had roots. And so in some senses, it was the presumption that the women were outside, or that were outsiders to begin with, was actually, so help me out, if I'm misreading, sort of this notion that it was grounded even then, right, in a sense of the history that was politically orchestrated. And if you could just say a little bit more about that, because I just want to make sure I'm following that.
So yeah, so initially, what ends up happening is right at this same time that the Persians bring the Israelites back to Jerusalem to reconstitute their city and their culture. The Greeks are just starting to come into power, and all these cultures, and especially Jewish culture, is encountering Greek culture. And Greek culture was significantly misogynist, not as much as the Romans, but more than some of the other major powers just before that. So there's this suspicion of the female in general, and I think what you're alluding to is that they begin to paint all women as just, maybe not essentially, but almost always potentially other. Is that what you're looking at?
Well,
Yeah.
right, and that's right. It sort of ends up being, that's actually the consequence, right? In that, but there was, and I'm sorry not to have, I'm the bad student who left my marked up book in my desk at work. But just sort of thinking that there was, just sort of a mischaracterization of, who were the out, drawing the line of, right, who had to go. It just seemed like there was a, political knowing, kind of like a knowingly false. And I was just curious if, there was, if
So
that was right.
There's lots of political stuff wrapped up in this. Part of it is that cultural push to define ourselves against the people next to us, that we're the people who do these things. We're not the people that do those things, like those people across the border. But what also ends up happening here is that they lean so hard into this that it starts out, there's only a couple of places where you're not supposed to marry a woman who's not, right? And most of those cultures are no longer alive by the time of Ezra.
Okay.
And so they've got to, but for whatever reason, he's compelled by this purity argument. And so he's trying to recast it against the other nations that they don't want to be like or assimilate with or connect with of his day. And he's citing much more ancient parts of the Bible, like Leviticus and et cetera, to come up with these ideas.
Okay.
Yeah.
How much did wealth and inheritance play into this?
Into which part of it?
Into the other, like wanting to keep people out?
Oh, yeah. So that's an interesting thing, because if you see what is said in Ezekiel, Ezekiel says that it's, the leaders and the priests and the rich folks, rich men who are mostly marrying these foreign wives. That's the magistrates and the leaders who are the first in this transgression. So yeah, if you got money, you can have more choices, just like any other time.
Oh, I thought that was one of the reasons they wanted to prohibit it, so that they would keep the wealth and the.
So that may be a thing, but I don't think in most of these ancient cultures around where Israel was, that if you were a woman, except in extreme circumstances, you couldn't inherit great amounts of wealth, and you could keep your house. But
Okay, so it wouldn't be a threat anyway. Okay.
I don't know that for certain,
Yeah,
but
but
most of it
yeah.
doesn't seem to
Okay.
work that way
Okay.
in the tales we have that have survived that time. Yeah. But that could be another reason that they're afraid of, because that was true in Catholicism. So in the 12th century, when they started to outlaw any priest from being able to marry, it was because a lot of Northern and Western European countries were granting women some power to inherit. And so if the local priest had, was the Monsignor of this big monastery, with all of its beer making and food making and all this other stuff, the last thing they wanted was it to be contended in a local court that somehow that ex-wife or their family got any of that. And so the whole notion of celibacy of the priesthood is an economic and power argument, much more than has anything to do significantly with holiness. Now, many cultures throughout time have suggested being celibate will make you more holy. I don't accept that argument, but that is an argument that's been made. But the reason the Catholic Church demanded all priests be celibate and not married, it was because of economy and inheritance.
And I'm sure I don't have to say to the group, or you could just allow women to be priests and you could still keep the wealth with them. How's that?
You're talking about a Roman church, the most misogynistic
But, you
culture
know,
we have in our history.
what would be possible, not politically, I hear you,
Yeah.
but
Ontologically.
yeah,
Although I have yet to figure out how it was that they couldn't marry, but they could have any number of concubines.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, they didn't call them that, but
I call them nuns.
Good stuff. Yeah, good. We should take this on the road. And then, of course, this whole bit gets into the seed. What are we doing with the seed? We don't want to put our supposedly holy seed. And I mean, it's just, it's a little much, man.
Reverend Scott, didn't the first story, though, that we were talking about with Joseph, with the Pharaoh's assistant's wife, wasn't he the other in that?
yes, he was.
Yeah, so what was
Yeah, we're going to wrap this up and we're going right to
I have a
Potiphar.
quick
Yes, yes.
Comment /
Bring it back.
question. So doesn't it seem like there's some phallocentrism here?
Why would you say something like
Did I just say that?
that? No. I want you to be exact. There's a lot of it. I want to see exactly what you see.
Yeah, so basically, it seems that Ezra is pointing the power back to the reproductive capacity of men versus women, and the choice to men, and the value, elevating the value of the seed,
Above all
and
else.
to balance out the value of the womb, so they get to choose the womb. But it's basically just worshiping manhood, right? It's completely phallocentric. And then the reference to seed is obviously like just a very easy to deconstruct metaphor.
No, I mean, you're exactly right. So here's the other thing that I find really reprehensible about some of these notions. So let me share this. I don't talk about this a lot, but I was married once before. My first wife was African American, and when we would go to my friend Fred's house in center of Baltimore City. It was a really weird, contentious neighborhood. So like 3 blocks away was the NAACP headquarters, and 3 blocks on the other side was like a Klan cell. You can't make this stuff up. And my buddy Fred, I was in a band, and my ex-wife used to come. And routinely, if I went to Fred's house with Josie, I would get a flyer on our windshield that said "Protect White Womanhood," because they had picked up on this same thing. That's what they.
Wow.
So both, protect white womanhood because of where do you put your seed as a man, but also, the obvious, protect white women from non-white men. And it was difficult to go to band practice after a while. I'm just going to put that out there, So, needless to say, my ex didn't always want to go over there as much as she loved Fred. So, that's a true story from.
If I may, We have to remember too, that despite the problem that we have with this ideology now, the ideology from day one with Abraham was, I will make of you a great nation. And nations depend on bloodlines.
Yep.
And all the we do this, we don't do that has to do with making that group of people big enough and strong enough to have power.
Mhm.
We can't look at it with racial eyes of now. We have to look at it with Jewish eyes of then.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
understand your irritation with the bloodline part,
Mhm.
but having been a practicing Jew who was told repeatedly that my sons were not Jewish because I was not born a Jew, I understand that completely.
Mhm. Mhm.
I've lived that dichotomy.
Bless your heart. All right. All right, we'll come back to more about how Greek thought begins to really change the Bible. That's where this bit on outsider women ends. I'm going to leave the rest of that there because I want us to get to some of the more colorful tales earlier. And so we're going to go to our page 74, villains, Potiphar's wife, Delilah, and the Talmud. We'll end with Delilah, but we're going to start with Potiphar's wife. And again, just the larger context of this story. Joseph was the favored of Israel's sons, and he, in the biblical narrative, he takes advantage of the fact that his dad likes him more. When all their other brothers are out there working in the field, he shows up with his fancy coat, and he does the books. He's like, they're all like toting rocks and digging trenches, and he's like writing stuff down and dreaming. And for some reason, they resent this. And so they want to get rid of him, but they're afraid of blood guilt. So first they abandon him in a hole. They're like, well, he's still going to die because we put him there. So they sell him into slavery, and he ends up in Egypt. And he's seen as someone with a lot of skills, very similar to Daniel. There's something about these prominent Jewish leaders of that era. They seem to be really good, and people know that they have skills that are needed. And so this guy, Potiphar, who's supposed to be some kind of counselor, Frymer-Kinsky suggested he might have been a eunuch, which was not uncommon for leading men in a court in Egypt to have to be a eunuch, just so they may not father a supposedly otherwise royal child when the Pharaoh wasn't looking. So let's just read this about Potiphar's wife, because it really is.
Why didn't she have a name?
Yeah, I was gonna ask the
I
same thing.
don't know.
That is so
I mean,
frustrating.
they
Everyone
named
else is.
Talk about, a way to
Maybe
just-
she's just so wild that she
doesn't want to name.
It's just what.
I mean, just based on
Maybe
the perception, not my perception.
maybe it wasn't just one wife.
So Joseph was very handsome, very lovely. It happened after these things. His master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. He refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not pay attention to what's in his house with me, for everything he has, he gave into my hand. And so, for he has not kept anything from me except for you, since you're his wife. And how would I do this great evil? I would sin against God. And so she spoke to Joseph daily. He did not listen to her or lie with her or be with her. So we're getting here, a good role model of resistance and abstinence. And then eventually, of course, she gets to a point where she's about to sort of try and be a little more assertive, and he flees with his robe in her hand. And then, of course, as has happened to many men who are slaves or who are not of the power class, he's accused of rape or attempted rape. This is very common that was done between white women and black men. And so he gets thrown into jail. So Joseph is at this point in jail. And what we learn after this thing is this is also part of God's plan, we find out in this part of Genesis, because it's while he's in jail that he talks to a cellmate, and that cellmate ends up working in the Pharaoh's court and remembers his cellmate as being someone who was a great interpreter of dreams. And Pharaoh's having all these dreams. And then so they eventually bring Joseph out of jail to be the Pharaoh's interpreter of dreams, which leads to the Pharaoh preparing the Egypt for the famine, because the dreams are about 7 years of plenty, 7 years of drought, famine, and he's basically like the right-hand man of the Pharaoh by the time all this is over. And so this is the larger arc of the story. But so tell me, why is she not named? That's a great question. I want other people to tell us why she's not named, because I don't know. Why do you think she's not named? It's supposed to be a warning to anyone, any man to stay away from a married woman.
Is she a prototype? Is she intended to be kind of a prototype or a
Archetype.
symbol? Thank you.
Yeah.
An archetype for foreign women, perhaps?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, she's a foreign woman too. I mean, Frymer-Kinsky doesn't talk a lot about that here, but yeah.
She's the other in the story, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
By the
Well,
narrators. She is,
That's why she's not named.
yeah, only Israeli women are the ones basically being named or have to do with the growing of the kingdom. And
I
she's
like
not-
that argument.
Sorry, I missed that.
I like that argument. I think that makes a lot of sense. That she's not named because her name isn't important. It's the fact that Joseph stood up to her, and she was just the mechanism that Adonai used to put Joseph where he needed to go.
That's right. So it's a convenient literary device to move the larger story of Israel's coming out of Egypt into place. And Frymer-Kinsky, because she's such a great student of other Near Eastern literature, reminds us on the bottom of page 76 that there was a very well-known Egyptian tale called the Tale of the Brothers, where a woman has been rejected by her husband's brother and accuses that brother of assaulting her. So this is a story. This is, again, one of those stories that must have been really well known, and the thought of actually putting together the Bible at this time without telling some of these stories, it wouldn't have been good authorship. And people listening would be like, I remember this other story, and that was really an interesting story. Why didn't you put it in your tale, right? I mean, a lot of times the stories that end up here that confuse us the most were really intended for an audience 3,000 years ago, because without that little episode, it would have been incomplete to them and not believable. And that's what sometimes the biggest confusing things to us are these things way out of context.
And it's supposed to be believable the way it is. I mean,
to those people,
I know.
to that audience, I think so. So I'll see if I can find a writing about genre. So
The thought that people study this and agonize over it and take it so seriously, so many people, is just really unbelievable to me. I mean, it's like, sorry.
Helen, you heard
I think our friend Tim quotes the Bible all the time, right, Foxy?
Oh yeah.
Foxy,
See her.
she's there.
Let's see. She'll come back. Maybe
Anyway.
she's
she
like,
might taking
So-
Our
our
friend Tim
Bible.
quotes the Bible all the time.
So that's another interesting thing. So older readers of the Bible, there were more listeners to the Bible because literacy was not as common. and there weren't printing presses, right? So, you know, one of the things that we've lost in human culture is our ability to remember vast amounts of things. So, you know, before the printing press, before other forms of printing, people remembered an enormous amount of pages of things. To this day in India, you know, to be a Brahmin priest in a certain form of Hinduism, you have to recite from beginning to end the 44,000 pages of the Rig Veda, right? So obviously human beings can do this. We don't because we do other things, but I mean, and so so people would sit around and tell these stories, and you know that's why the Jewish worship really laid the groundwork for lectionary Christian worship. So they read certain parts of the Bible during the year. You know, so you make your way through, you know, not every word, but all the parts of the Bible, you know, over a year, whereas in Christianity, it's more over 3 years. But that's so you encounter it all. But before it was written, you just had to know. You know, I mean, and it's a fascinating thing to think of, but I still remember to this day, some of you might remember this, before the age of cell phones, I had in my brain 120 phone numbers and names, and about half the addresses I could remember. And ever since cell phones,
But now.
but now it means no phone number.
Right, right.
No one needs to, I don't, you know, I know.
That's what a Rolodex was for.
Yeah, exactly.
So I used to have fun with this when I used to teach English in Baltimore City, because I wanted to get the kids to memorize poetry. And I'm a bit of a trickster, a little bit like Jacob. And so the first week I would have them come in and I would say, any song you want, you can sing it, you can just speak the lyrics. You know, if they're a little bit edgy, you know, I don't care so long as there's not too much nastiness. So they would come in and I would have them print it out or write it out. And it'll be like, you know, 50, 70, 80 lines, and they remembered them all. And then I would say, well, next week you need to come and memorize a Shakespeare sonnet. And they would all moan. I'm like, that's only 14 lines. You just did 115 of 50 Cent. You can do 14 lines. And they were all grown. And they knew there was no way they were getting off the hook. A little trouble for some of the songs that would bring to class.
I wish I'd taken his classes.
Really?
That was a great, I always had that gotcha on a Friday afternoon. All right, you guys did great this week. You're so good. You're getting Shakespeare this week. Oh no! It was a predominantly African-American school. So I don't want to talk about some old white guy. You're not going to talk about him. You're going to recite the sonnets. It's big difference.
Because they probably were like, oh, I thought we were going to talk about 50 Cent. Right?
Well, 1992, what was there to say about him? Except he had a couple of things.
Yeah.
Now he has so much more to talk about. All right, let's get back to this. We'll finish with Delilah, but we'll do Atalia next, because this is someone that's not as well known.
What page is that?
And Atalia is on page 85 in the villains.
Yeah.
So it's after Delilah.
Yeah.
Was that in our reading?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was one of the ones.
It's all marked up, so I'll be there.
So the
Moses means kills all the royals.
yeah, well again, there's more seed here for you, Foxy. It's a seedy class tonight.
No spring's coming.
That's right. That's right. So Atalia, it's a very short story. I mean, it's all it is practically, right? So it's another slaughter of the innocents. This happens a few times in the ancient biblical literature. And these echoes happen, they happen for genre reasons as much as any other reason, because whenever, you know, whole societies are supposed to get in an uproar, there's only a handful of things that supposedly will do this. And of course, the slaughter of the innocents is one. And the slaughter of the innocents is also brought up during Moses and the Exodus. And so this is just an echo of that. from the Book of Kings. And the Book of Kings is very concerned with the foreign wives nonsense, right? It's just, it's drenched with that. You know, half of the Book of Kings seems to be about Jezebel, for God's sake, right? Which is just the greatest. How come no one names their child Jezebel?
I wonder.
Oh, you guys make me laugh. All right. So, and there doesn't seem to be, I mean, Atalia seems to be Israelite, but she's often been labeled a foreigner, but Frymer-Kinsky says there's no evidence for that. That this whole notion of the slaughter of the innocents comes about, and we're not really sure why. That's why I find this whole piece so bloody. And so, like, it's why. And so she was the mother of Ahaziah, and she saw that her son had died, and she arose and killed all the royal seed. So all the other children, some of them hers, some of those her own grandkids and or nieces and such, she kills all of the royal seed except for one, Joash. And Joash, who was Ahaziah's son, was stolen away. And then what we learn is that later this son Joash is brought back to the temple, and they finally get rid of Atalia. But so there are very few members of the royal line left for her to kill, because Jehu, the general, had killed off the Amrides, and he had also slain Atalia's son Ahaziah, who was visiting the king of North Israel at the time of the coup. And Ahaziah has 42 brothers. 42 brothers. I thought I had a big family. The few members of the royal family that he left alive could not have posed much of a threat to her. But so what I think Frymer-Kinsky is pointing to is the sheer bloody nature of Jehu's revolt and his religious zeal may have just created just like a sort of bloodlust that, like, this is what, you know, I mean, almost like, it's almost like what they say in warfare, like you open up that Pandora's box and you can't stop the bloodletting, right? And so she seems to be suggesting to that maybe this is it, or maybe she was doing it out of fear, because Jehu claimed the word of God was the justification for his slaughter of the house of Ahab. But all of these things, it's just horrifying. And so what are we to make about this? Because I find this a puzzling episode. What do you make of it? Anything more than we've said? Or
No, I don't understand it. It's less. When her son died, she was so distraught that she just went crazy.
Yeah, that's the thought I had.
That's what I had.
At least it
That's
wasn't
what-
even just an option there. I mean, we have plenty of stories of men who've gone off the rails.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
rage or just.
Mental health
right,
crisis.
you know,
Yeah.
Mental health has always been an issue.
and to think that
Yeah.
you know, that do kill their family members, kill
Yeah,
themselves. I mean, over, I mean,
And the unexpected death of a child is anything to make you break, right?
Yeah.
and the main difference here, the woman that's doing it, just does seem to be more unusual, at least in this tale. Yeah. Go ahead, Fox.
Well,
I
I
didn't say
you know,
anything.
I didn't know if they were, is that, I'm sorry, it's step here. Is that, first I'm thinking, well, it says her husband died. And so your husband dies, your child died. So she's could have had a psychotic break, but I know it's not meant to be thinking. So is the point, you know, women are crazy. Because if I know that we don't look at the Bible literally, but to kill 42 people, royal children, there are guards around, there are nannies around. One person cannot kill with a knife 42 people. That was my thought, is that, okay, so this is meant as some kind of message about women having uncontrollable rage and killing innocents or something. I didn't make that much more of it, but it just seemed that as someone, I think Johanna said, or Nicole or someone, that, you know, it's a mental health issue, but that also the sheer number is there to inspire terror of a woman, I think. She didn't kill 1 or 2 people, 42 people with her bare hand. You can see like a Lady Macbeth running through the halls with blood or something, you know, I don't know.
Now, Atalia did not have killed the 42. That was Jehu. Jehu, let's get that one straight for us, right?
Oh, misreading. Okay,
whoever-
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. But she does kill the rest of the royal line except for one. They make it sound like
Right. So
she
that's
thought she
why
had killed the
He
baby.
was hidden, right? Or-
Yeah, it was like he was young and lying on the floor, and who knows? But yeah.
Did she attack the royal family because her husband and son died by the hand of somebody in the royal family? Or we don't know.
Yeah, and that's a good question, Mary. I had that same, I'm sorry,
No,
yeah, I
no.
had the same, I read it twice because I thought like, is there something in there about, right, yeah.
No, all I had was question marks on this one.
Yeah.
It says there were very few members of the royal line left for her to kill.
Yeah, so there weren't many because it was, what was it? Where were the 42?
Jehu.
Yeah, Jehu killed the 42 brothers of Ahaziah, and Ahaziah was Atalia's son. And so her son and all of the nephews. Yeah, so this is just, it's a curious episode, and Lady Macbeth or Electra or some other famously bloodthirsty women throughout the ages, but there aren't many. And and this is one of those places where a woman does the difficult thing, the hard thing, the bloody thing, and actually rules for 6 years. It's very unusual for women to be ruling over these people in the Bible. That's another very strange and interesting thing that they don't explain. Almost as if they don't want too many people to know that there was a woman that was ruling them at some point in history. I don't know, but it's interesting to me that that's just sort of glossed over. And actually, Frymer-Kinsky doesn't really. I'm surprised she doesn't, reflect on that a little bit.
And but there's some suggestion, right, that she's dissident or could have been caught up in the dissident. There's some suggestion that she was, essentially a traitor or not, like she kills, her own family, but she's part of the dissident. I'm using the term here, but movement, and she ascends to power as part of that, right? Ousting, and in doing so does what men do repeatedly through history: kill their own children or exile them or their own wives, so to do so.
All right, well, we're not gonna come to any final conclusions about this particular woman. So let's turn to Delilah and Samson.
Big finale.
Yeah.
And this is page 77. It's in the villains chapter. So it's after Potiphar's wife, that section. And so here we are in the book of Judges, and Judges comes after Samuel, and in the book of Samuel is one of the first times that the Israelites are asking for a king. There's a lot of reasons for this, and I would love to just teach that part of Samuel for a few classes because it's fascinating. And Samuel tries to tell them what an awful thing it is you're asking for. To appoint someone who has absolute power over you. Because this is what will happen. And they're like, yeah, we know, give us a king. And he goes on and on, for pages, and they're like, yeah, we know, give us a king. So, that's how, first Saul and then David become kings. And so it's just, and so here we are in that part of the Bible.
Reverend Scott, can I
Yes.
exercise my interruption?
Yes, please, of
card and
course,
just
always.
say, I think you might have even preached on it, or Reverend Anya, about, the data that came out, several years ago about Americans shifting to favoring authoritarianism over democracy, right? So that, and Deb helped me out on the, on the social science research, but, just sort of thinking
Yeah.
about the timeliness
Yeah.
of that when a people come to
Yes.
give up, right, or align, against, themselves, and just, so that resonated that just really hit me as like, here we are again, we need a king.
Voting
We
against
need
our
right, let's
Yeah.
get somebody authoritarian in here, because.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever done it here, but I've preached
I feel
at
it.
length from
Right.
that passage in Samuel where he's trying to teach the people what a dumb idea this is.
Well,
Right.
And their response is always just one line. Yeah, give us a king. I mean, it's
Wow.
just that. They don't, it's never quite explained. And then, of course, the whole like books of Kings and Chronicles is telling us what a bad idea that was, because the kings never behave themselves and they keep getting Israel conquered and exiled. All right, so Delilah. So I love how she reminds us that the Delilah story is not necessarily about sexuality and sensuality, right? It is about something different. And let's start with Samson's parentage. And his tale seems to remind many scholars of Greek heroes and other heroes from the region in ways that a lot of the Bible doesn't. And his parentage, this is on page 77, there's the divine envoy and Samson's mother have made some modern readers suspect the angel causes the pregnancy. Maybe that's why he has superhuman powers, right? Because that's throughout Greek literature. There's, a Greek god who can't help but fall in love with a human woman, and that child always has some special characteristics, right? And interestingly, Frymer-Kinsky says, and this is to your point earlier, Nicole, that pregnancy was caused either through sexual intercourse or through speech. The power of language in a different way, right?
Yeah.
And the notion of what's called a speech act, or is embedded in biblical studies. So what a speech act is simply the first chapter of Genesis, where God says, "Let there be light," and there's light. You don't have to do anything; you just say it, and because you're the deity or you have power, it becomes so. So she suggests that this actually could have been a speech act that created the parenting of Samson. And Samson is limited in his abilities, like most good heroes in heroic literature. There's always some kind of tragic flaw or way to weaken their powers.
Wouldn't that kind of
Exactly. Yeah.
wouldn't that kind of imply that Adonai was taking the form of this angel? Or do we honestly believe that the angels have the same powers that the God does?
Yeah, there you go. Great questions. I can't wait to see your dissertation.
No.
I mean, it really.
So his stupidity was his Achilles heel?
His gullibleness?
So yeah, and this, a lot of this part of the Bible, the history part of the Bible, begins like this: it happened after these matters. You see that phrase so many times.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
And so we find out where she's from, and she is not an outsider. The Valley of Sorek is squarely within the territory where she could be considered, a member of the Jewish tribe. For some reason, it's mixed, and she has lots of friends who are Canaanites, Philistines, excuse me, who are trying to get at Samson. And this is after Samson's already had like an unfortunate a couple of other relationships, right? With one woman who gets burned, right? Right. Yeah. He tries to marry a Philistine woman and proposes a riddle for a wedding wager, and they can't answer it, and they end up like burning her. I mean, it's awful. They burn the bride and her household in revenge. And,
Which is weird because the Tanakh says that he goes back to talk to her later.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So they don't quite explain that one. So then we see. So tell me about this sweet talking that apparently Delilah is so good at. Somebody want to explain this to me?
Wear them down. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Directing, right, war of attrition.
I just wanted to know, since, you know. it looks like
Lysistrata core.
Most,
Now,
most, most,
Is there anything stronger than a Lysistrata core behavior to
Yeah.
someone who has just married? You're not getting any unless I find out what's going on.
that's from the Greek play Lysistrata. That's right, where the women refuse certain types of company unless they stop the war, right? Fascinating. So obviously, it seems like these authors have had some contact with Greek culture, because this story seems way too Greek to not have been somewhat influenced here and there. And so, is he stupid, or does he just have no respect for her ability? Or, like, you would think like 3 times
Right.
that he wakes up and
Right.
the Philistines are there,
Right.
you know, that this is more than just typical pillar talk here, you know? Right? You know,
Yeah, this is
what's going on?
stupidity.
Is
This
You
is
know?
plain. Reading this reminded me of that commercial on TV where, oh, let's hide in the car. Oh no, let's go and hide in the barn. And the guy standing in the barn with the saw.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, the bad decisions he makes.
Means,
Yeah.
yeah.
But so it says here that he
Um,
did not, Yahweh had turned away from him.
Oh,
So if he had still been with him, that wouldn't have happened when they raised him, is that?
so there's something bizarre about being a Nazarene that, you know, you take this vow that you're gonna live this way, which
Mhm. includes
not shaving your beard or cutting your hair. And if you allow someone to do this to you, you know, at least the belief is that
Right,
God would
okay.
be, you know, mad at you for a moment
So
and
he
turn away.
assumes, right, okay.
Right? Yeah, and so and she knows her man. He's actually told her the truth this time.
Yeah.
He told me his whole part, she says. And they come up to her and bring her money. Seems to be quite a bit of money. Frymer-Kinsky talks about how much more this is than Judas gets for turning in Jesus.
Yeah.
And, you know, others get, you know, more than what Joseph is, you know, bought for, you know, quite a lot more, you know. And there we go. And the climatic moment, Yahweh, he has turned his strength away. And this just ties into all these old myths, you know, other ones around the ancient Near East, particularly Gilgamesh, which Frymer-Kinsky goes into, where Q is civilized by a woman. He's a wild man who has made things dangerous because he sided with the animals against the people and the gods. And they come up with this woman who civilizes him with talk and sex and beer, I believe are the 3 things. And he decides, okay, I'm going to be human after all. It's a classic tale of how have we become civilized? How are we no longer wild and just objects of nature?
Reverend Scott,
Yes, please.
this was a point that maybe Foxy or Debbie or Joanna can, or you can go to. When I read this thing, Joseph FK was talking about getting the hair is animalistic versus the civilized humanity. And Joseph Campbell in the Gilgamesh myth was saying that the wild represents being part of the divine, unhampered by human conventionalities and sophisticated hypocrisies. This separation from nature, could that possibly be a separation from a goddess worship, a nature religion? Trying to say even a woman sees the error of those ways by having the woman take the uncivilized divine nature worshiper down?
No, I think it's a good, Mary, I appreciate your question. I mean, I don't know the answer, but it did, those questions were also there for me, just in terms of the, you know, the gendering, that we live with now around, you know, women as uncontrollable, women as right nature, women as, and therefore other, and therefore less than, and reason, and masculinity, and, you know, confidence, and, you know, power being tied together now, right? So that's sort of, where were we in, you know, historically, that there might be something going on, where that is shifting up, that I, you know, was trying to get my mind around as well. Because yeah, that was, those were interesting questions to me as well. Right, you know, that we have this fallen hero who has really so much feminine qualities, actually, right? Or what gets associated with femininity. And you know, taming of women, and women as then the civil, you know, we have, of course, still the like women as the have to keep men in check, right? Even today, right? It's, you know, that's just so, you know, story. At the same time, it lives right there with, you know, I mean, it's just that kind of paradox, though, of then those civilized men, you know, have, you know, marked women, right, as the, you know, as the other, the uncivilized, the out of control. So it's sort of, so yeah, no answer, Mary, but with you on.
Yeah,
on
I'm just
that.
seeing nature as worship of the goddess,
Totally, right. I could
getting
totally see
back
that.
into that. And this is another way of digging in and saying we are above nature in our religion. That's not a good religion. The goddess is no good. You're above it. And even this woman understands that.
Yep.
So that's really an important issue, and I think we should, you know, talk about that for the what little time we have left. There is this fluid notion, and it comes up whenever, you know, the patriarchy finds it convenient, that at sometimes, you know, it's the women who are the civilized ones, who are keeping us in check, who are reminding us of the importance of home and keeping going to that job and everything else. And there's the other side where women are to be feared because they don't know how to control their sensuality, or their sensuality is dangerous, or, you know, they're a little too natural. But in the context of this myth here, what you're saying, Mary, there is a lot of evidence that what's happening a lot of times in the more ancient stories in the Bible is they are criticizing the religions of the peoples around them. I talked about this last week with simply the word that in Hebrew, tahom, which means the deep. And whenever you're thinking about that image of God's face hovering over the face of the deep, tahom has its etymological origin from Akkadian Tiamat, the goddess of the sea. And it's very much an image of conquest and of male domination. And whenever the priests are most angry at Israel is whenever they're setting up altars in nature. You often hear that they set up a tenebrith out here in the woods somewhere, because you know, they don't have time to go to Jerusalem and do the rituals. They're trying to do it, you know, and for a long time, if you didn't do it in the temple in Jerusalem, it wasn't considered official. But of course, you know, people living far away, when there weren't automobiles and trains, you know, then they wanted to worship, they created their own altars, as people will do. This is what people do. And they were terrified of that. The other thing that I think is wrapped up in this is some of the new learning we're finding about the origin of human culture. And this comes from some more recent studies, some of them expressed in the book, The Dawn of Everything, that I'm making my way through. And one of the things that seems to be true in that is that the culture of the city and the culture of the next big political entity near the city, but that isn't a city, seems to have always been at odds. And the culture that's the city, I mean, it's where we get the name urban for urbane. That's where we get the notion of the same English root word for city is the same root word for civilization. And what we're finding is that the cultures around the city hold on to what I'll call more romantic notions of old sort of wild hunter warrior cultures. The city cultures were usually not warrior cultures. You know, you can't have a bunch of people riding around doing swordplay in the middle of the streets. You got a packed city, right? And but often the suburbs, I'll use that modern term, often, especially if they were organized into somewhat of a powerful political entity, again, they were defining themselves in deliberate opposition to that city nearby. And I think in many ways, the Bible doesn't know what to do with this. So when you see the story of Cain and Abel, Cain is the farmer who grows wheat and brings that as something to God, but Abel brings and slaughters a lamb, and it becomes favored by God because God, in that part of the Bible, still loves the smell and taste of meat. And this angers Cain, who's done all this work to cultivate this land and wait for 6 months and harvest wheat. And he basically gets told, well, you're second fiddle to your brother. And so this tension between the urban and the country, between the urban and the suburban, between a cultured life the way that we might understand it in an urban suburb like Montclair, as to like maybe the outlands of Hunterdon County, New Jersey, which may have a different view of what it means to be proud or manly or other things. This is ancient. This has been going on since there have been cities and civilizations living next to each other. And obviously the places with the wider open spaces near the frontier always embraced that sort of wildness, even well after that wasn't their main means of sustenance, because it was the cultural identifier. And I think what I see in all these stories like this is, the wild man is to be, especially by certain lady types, but really feared because we can't control him, and so it's fascinating. The Samson story, doesn't really take us much towards theology in many ways, because he ends up getting blinded, and of course he brings the temple down in a later episode, but it just seems like a colorful tale that needed to be in the book, but the way they tell it helps us understand their culture, because unlike Enkidu, whose woman consort saves him and makes him a better man, Delilah gets him blinded and almost killed, right? And so there's that. So what is the story really? Fear, culture, and civilization? Should we? I find it really inconclusive, which I think is why people keep talking about the story, and Hollywood likes to make up what they think it means to make a better movie, because there's no real conclusion, I feel.
Because civilization, we're in global capitalism. We haven't sorted out what kind of brotherhoods or manhoods are actually, right, the ones we are supposed to revere. So we keep, right, telling the story again and again with the new frontiers. So he's going to be the next, right, man that gets shaved by some other men, with women actually acting as the thugs. Stay tuned.
Oh my God. The plot gets thicker every week. All right. Well, we have come to the end of our time, plus about 5 minutes. Thank you so much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Nicole and Debbie and maybe a couple others, our sisters in law, and Boxy brings the next week's class on Hagar.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, thank you
I
for
won't be
sending
here.
the link.
I can't be here.
Yeah. Oh, you're not
You're
gonna be
welcome.
here?
I can't be.
All right, well, that's okay. We will send you out we'll record it so you can make sure you catch
Okay.
every wild and fun minute.
Reverend Scott, you had mentioned something earlier about, you made a comment about slaughter of the innocents, and you said sort of one of the times, or one of the places where it sounds like you were saying if people would, I just want to make sure I understood, sort of rise up or stand together. I mean, just, you're saying like, here's where people will rally, right? Slaughter of the innocents.
Yeah.
Is that what you were getting? I just was.
It seems to be a marker that will get, of course, the people who are being slaughtered united against whoever is doing the slaughter. And so, you know, we see it in Moses. And it first makes Pharaoh sad, so sad that it looks like Moses is able to, he's all right, finally get out of here once the Pharaoh's son has died. But in the Christian scriptures, there's another echo of this where Herod, when he gets a notion that the king of the Jews is being born, he tries to slaughter all the innocents of his own, and that actually unites the people against Herod. So it's a recurring story, and sadly, for whatever reason, it recurs way more, not just in literary history, but human history. Than
I hope it happens now with Putin.
No, unfortunately, it's working the other way around. He's been bombing residential areas all day.
No, Russia may rise up against him this time. That's what I'm hoping.
May they wake up and see the roses.
I was interested in seeing, like, okay, you can get pregnant from talking. So the virgin birth story is going on for many, forever, huh? It's always been,
well, we don't know that his mother was a virgin before that divine encounter.
Well,
but yes, but this notion of
right.
divine parentage or mystical parentage is a recurring theme.
Yeah.
And it's a recurring theme, not just for the theological mission of the text.
Yeah.
It's also a recurring theme because the genre of what's called hagiography, which is telling the story of great people, it was a literary convention that they had to have some kind of special birth parentage.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't like that they didn't totally understand either.
And you can read great biographies of important figures from, especially from around the time of Jesus. It's even more popular in the literary style then. You can't get a story about a supposedly great person where they don't have some divine parentage, right?
Okay.
Because it's just like in a romance novel. You're not going to think it's going to be steamy enough unless it has that guy with his hair and his chest sticking out. You know, I mean, right. I mean, it's a literary convention.
Yes.
People wouldn't accept it as the literature they were looking
So
for.
why was Jesus so special then? If there this went on, well, because he rose from the dead, I guess. That was more than.
That's all wrapped up in the fact that Jerusalem gets destroyed and the Jews are separated out.
Yeah.
And the stories of Jesus live in the synagogues around the Roman Empire, and it becomes a sort of first just a different kind of Judaism until they have to split. But that's a whole other class. But yeah.
This is like more of a yes.
Well, that's okay with me. I mean, you know, I'm not trying to put you in one can or another.
It's so funny because I mean I consider myself spiritual, but not believing in a sort of, you know,
All right.
your personal, you know,
Good night, everybody, and thank you very much.